shocking list of Obama's accomplishments as first black president of U.S. has just been released. When Barack Obama was elected president, the left went wild with excitement, and for the last 8 years, they continued with their unabashed praise. For years, the left has touted Obama as some sort of savior sent from Chicago to save the country from the freedom we had been enjoying. Conservatives across the country were left in shock when Barack Obama was elected for 2 terms as president, even after he promised to put America on the path to socialism. However, the real fun began when he was inaugurated, and the traitor-in-chief put in motion his plans to fundamentally transform America. First, he went on an apology tour around the world. Then Obama began to pit Americans against each other with identity politics, and finally, he usurped the Constitution every chance he got, making a mockery of our constitutional republic. The mainstream media continually reported how Obama was a visionary and how he was changing America for the better, but we conservatives knew the truth. For close to a decade, Obama did his best to chip away at the very fabric of our nation, leaving us more in debt and vulnerable to our enemies than ever. After Obama finally left the White House last January, the mainstream media and lunatic left went into mourning over the fact he was no longer in office. The talking heads on the nightly news began to recite all his stunning, those are their words, not mine, list of achievements Obama made during his time in office. But they seem to forget a few. So, considering that we are approaching the 1-year anniversary of Barack Obama finally moving out of the White House, we thought we would put together a list of all of the first black president's achievements, and they are shocking. First president to apply for college aid as a foreign student, then deny he was a foreigner. First president to have a social security number from a state he has never lived in. First president to preside over a cut to the credit rating of the United States. First president to violate the War Powers Act. First president to be held in contempt of court for illegally obstructing oil drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. First president to require all Americans to purchase a product from a third party. First president to spend $1 billion on shovel-ready jobs when there was no such thing as shovel-ready jobs. First president to abrogate bankruptcy law to turn over control of companies to his union supporters. First president to bypass Congress and implement the DREAM Act through executive fiat. First president to order a secret amnesty program that stopped the deportation of illegal immigrants across the U.S., including those with criminal convictions. First president to demand a company hand over $20 billion to one of his political appointees. First president to tell a CEO of a major corporation, Chrysler, to resign. First president to terminate America's ability to put a man in space. First president to cancel the National Day of Prayer and to say that America is no longer a Christian nation. First president to have a law signed by an auto pen without being present. First president to arbitrarily declare an existing law unconstitutional and refuse to enforce it. First president to threaten insurance companies if they publicly spoke out on the reasons for their rate increases. First president to tell a major manufacturing company in which state it is allowed to locate a factory. First president to file lawsuits against the states he swore an oath to protect, as we owe in. First president to withdraw an existing coal permit that had been properly issued years ago. First president to actively try to bankrupt an American industry, coal. First president to fire an inspector general of AmeriCorps for catching one of his friends in a corruption case. First president to appoint 45 czars to replace elected officials in his office. First president to surround himself with radical left-wing anarchists. First president to golf more than 150 separate times in his 5 years in office. First president to hide his birth, medical, educational and travel records. First president to win the Nobel Peace Prize for doing nothing to earn it. First president to go on multiple global apology tours and concurrent insult or friends tours. First president to go on over 17 lavish vacations, in addition to date nights and Wednesday evening White House parties for his friends paid for by the taxpayers.